Welcome to today's Explainer. We're going to dive right into some truly fascinating research by Andrea Freeman, all about how the credit card industry actually operates. When we look at the massive amounts of consumer debt out there, we usually think of it as a personal failure, right? Like maybe just a flaw in the system. But the source material we're examining today, Payback, a structural analysis of the credit card problem, totally flips that entire narrative on its head.
Let's kick things off with a pretty simple question. When credit card companies are out there looking for their absolute perfect customer, who exactly are they targeting? Now, you might intuitively think, well, it's got to be the wealthy individual, right? The person who spends thousands of dollars and reliably pays off their bill every single month. Well, the research tells a very, very different story.
Prepare for a major paradigm shift here, because it turns out the massive consumer debt crisis we hear so much about, it isn't a market failure at all. It's actually a meticulously calculated market success. Thanks to some super advanced underwriting tech developed back in the 1990s, lenders can build these complex statistical models to predict exactly how we're going to spend and repay. And what they found is kind of shocking. The most profitable consumer is actually the one teetering right on the verge of bankruptcy. Section 1. Anatomy of the industry.
To really understand how we got here, we've got to realize that the industry completely changed its business model over the last few decades. So, historically, companies sought out what they called convenience users. Think back to the early days, right? Like the Diners Club in 1949, where traveling businessmen would charge their meals and just pay it all off in full at the end of the month. But get this. Today, the industry actually refers to these financially stable individuals who pay off their balances as deadbeats. Crazy, right? And why? Simply because they don't generate high profits. They avoid interest, and they certainly don't rack up late fees. Instead, there's been this massive shift toward targeting the subsistence user. This is someone who's trapped revolving their balances from month to month, literally just to stay afloat. We're not talking about people buying luxury vacations here. They're using credit cards as a lifeline, to pay the electricity bill, buy groceries, or cover an unexpected medical emergency simply because the social safety net just isn't there. And for the credit card industry, this type of user is an absolute goldmine.
Which brings us to Section 2, predatory tactics and traps.
So, once banks were legally allowed to export the super permissive usury laws of their home states, which basically deregulated interest rates and fees across the board, the race was officially on. Just to put this into perspective, a staggering 80% of credit card industry profits today come from interest payments and penalty fees, not merchant transaction fees. The original business model was built on just taking a tiny little cut from the merchant every time a card was swiped. But now, it's almost entirely built right on the backs of consumers who just cannot afford to pay down their principal balances.
And companies are using some highly specific predatory tactics to lure in these subsistence users. They're perfectly designing products that result in these totally unmanageable debt spirals. For instance, they use teaser rates of 0%. That suddenly just skyrocket. Or they'll flood vulnerable zip codes with pre-approved mass mailings, specifically targeting folks who are probably too busy working multiple jobs to shop around for better rates. And the source material highlights something called fee harvesting cards, which is just wild. In one cited example, a consumer is offered a $300 credit limit. Okay, sounds helpful, right? But wait, it comes with a $79 application fee and an additional $281 fee right upon approval. That means the debt is literally designed to be unmanageable from day one.
All right, moving right along. Section 3, why current fixes fail.
Now, you're probably wondering, why haven't government regulations fixed this yet? Well, the author argues that the problem is both neoclassical and behavioral economists completely misdiagnose the root of the issue. They fail because their proposed solutions falsely assume that every single consumer has a rational, totally free choice in whether or not to actually use credit. So on one side, you have neoclassical economists who think it's just an information problem. So they push for longer, clearer disclosures, kind of like what we saw in the 2009 Card Act. On the other side, behavioral economists think it's a psychological problem. They argue consumers are these hyperbolic discounters who just need to be educated out of their bad habits.
But the research points out a massive, glaring flaw in both of these theories. Think about it. If your absolute only option to pay a surprise medical bill, or say buy diapers for your kid, is to use a high-interest credit card, well, no amount of fine print disclosure or fancy psychological debiasing is gonna change your behavior. You don't need a seminar on rational spending. You just need to survive until the end of the week. These traditional fixes are treating all consumers as if they're completely identical, and in doing so, they're completely ignoring the desperate day-to-day reality of the subsistence user. Let's unpack this a bit more in Section 4, Structural Inequality and Vulnerability.
To really grasp this vulnerability, we have to zoom out and look at structural inequality. It's really not just a matter of individual financial choices. It is deeply, deeply tied to historical and systemic barriers. Just look at the 2009 data the author cites. It reveals a stark, nearly 20-to-1 wealth gap. White households had a median wealth of over $113,000, while Latino and African American households had roughly $6,000 and $5,000 respectively. I mean, that is a massive gap, and it leaves minority households without any real financial safety net in times of crisis, which practically forces a reliance on the subprime credit market just to stay afloat.
And it gets even more systemic. A really striking study from the Boston Federal Reserve Bank found clear evidence of credit card redlining. They documented how systemic discrimination actively targets these communities with noticeably inferior financial products. In fact, the study found that even when risk profiles and payment histories were literally identical, consumers in predominantly African American neighborhoods were offered $7,000 less in available credit compared to those in predominantly white neighborhoods. Just let that sink in for a second.
So what the author is showing here is that deeply embedded social structures, not just individual spending habits, create this sort of captive market for highly profitable subprime credit products. The research details how historical policies, things like early housing discrimination and the lack of access to formal store credit, basically forced minority consumers into installment credit and payday loans back in the day. Fast forward to today, and that legacy has evolved into a system where the credit card industry actively mines these marginalized communities for massive profits through subprime cards.
So, how do we fix it? That brings us to Section 5, rewriting the rules.
If basic consumer education clearly doesn't work for people who literally have no other choice but to borrow, what is the actual path forward here? Well, Freeman outlines 4 pretty bold steps to amend the 2009 Card Act. The goal? Shifting the regulatory burden away from the consumer's choices and placing it squarely onto the industry's practices. First up, we absolutely still need disclosures, but not for the consumer. We need the industry to disclose where its profits are actually coming from. Second, reinstate federal usury laws to finally cap those exploitative interest rates. Third, require banks to actually help create asset-based savings accounts for low-income consumers. But honestly, it's the 4th step she proposes that is truly groundbreaking.
The most provocative step by far is something called subsistence amnesty. This would essentially compel credit card companies to stop profiting off of basic survival needs. Think about it. This would temporarily eliminate all interest and fees on purchases that individuals living in poverty make literally just to survive. We're talking groceries, gas, utility bills, the absolute basics. By doing this, consumers could actually start paying down their principal balances and finally escape that endless debt spiral.
And by cutting off those massive profits currently being extracted from the poorest users, this amnesty would force banks to return to their original business model. Remember the convenience users we talked about earlier? Yeah, them. If it's no longer highly profitable to keep low-income folks trapped in this cycle of endless fees and sky-high interest, the credit card companies are going to have to go back to competing for the business of wealthier lifestyle users who want cards for convenience and rewards. It shifts the burden entirely back to where it belongs. I'm going to leave you with this final thought from today's explainer. As we speed toward an increasingly cashless society, we really have to decide if we want our credit system to be a tool for convenience or a trap for the vulnerable. Credit cards have basically become a required passport for modern life, right? You need one to rent a car, book a hotel, buy a plane ticket, the whole shebang. So if participating in society demands access to credit, we have to ask ourselves, are we really comfortable allowing a system to turn the basic, everyday survival of our most vulnerable citizens into its primary engine for profit?